Thank you so much. Can you hear this okay? Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much for coming out tonight to watch this film with us and to listen to the panel and hopefully to mingle and meet each other and hopefully be inspired by everything that we saw and that we'll hear today so that we can take that back into our work. So I just want to take a few minutes to introduce the panel. I'll start here with Scott Traylor. His mom always said that he was a Mr. Rogers baby because he never missed an episode, never missed a show of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and that's likely where Scott found his deep interest in children's media. Now, grown-up Scott has a long history of developing award-winning media products for children. He's worked for clients including Disney, Pokemon, Hasbro, Sesame Workshop, Nickelodeon, and many others. He's especially proud to have worked with Family Communications, which is now called the Fred Rogers Productions. He's a board member and a trustee and advisor to a number of child-focused learning companies, a former computer science educator at Harvard, and continues to work in the children's media space today. So thank you, Scott, for being here.
Thank you, Julie, for having me.
All right, David Newell. Thank you for being here today. David Newell played the beloved Mr. McFeely for over 30 years. Series Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Even though Mr. McFeely's schedule was often very busy, he always had time for his familiar speedy delivery greeting.
Speed delivery.
Away from the character makeup, David assumed many behind-the-scenes responsibilities for Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Having been with the series since its inception in 1967, he was properties manager, associate producer, and director of public relations for Family Communications, the producer of the series. He's now a board member of the Pittsburgh Zoo and PBG Aquarium and the Theater Historical Society of America. So thank you, David, for being with us today. And Donna Mitroff is the founder and president of the Kidvicket Group, LLC. She holds a PhD in education and an MA in special education. Donna is an educator and children's media expert with nearly 3 decades of experience in many sectors of the entertainment industry, including commercial broadcasting, cable, and public television. She consults with production companies, networks, and studios in the areas of program development, content design, children and families, media policy, and many other topics. She started her media career in Pittsburgh, where she worked with Fred Rogers of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. In 2012, Donna and her husband, Aya Mitroff, who's also here tonight, co-authored and published Fables and the Art of Leadership, applying the wisdom of Mr. Rogers to the workplace. Donna is proud that while Pinocchio had Jiminy Cricket as the conscience on his shoulder, she had the experience of Fred Rogers as the conscience on her shoulder in all her work in children's media. Thank you. Okay, so I have some questions for the panel, and afterwards we're hoping that, we'll have time for you to ask questions as well. So as we're going through this, hopefully you're inspired to think of some questions, and you'll have an opportunity to ask the panel questions. Then we will bring Jason, who's our stand-in Mr. Rogers, up. He'll do the raffle, so hopefully you all have your tickets. Clement's got a few announcements after that, and then we'll have another half hour or so out in the lobby for photos, if anybody wants to take some photos, get some autographs, and just mingle and meet with each other. So that's what we'll do for the rest of the evening. Okay, so each of you is here on the panel today in part because of your rich and interesting connections to Fred Rogers himself or the organization. So I would love for you to start by telling us briefly how you came to know either Fred Rogers or the organization, and then share 1 or 2 of your favorite memories of working, again, with Fred or with the organization. And we're hoping that that will provide additional insights into his philosophy and ethos beyond what we saw today in the screening of Won't You Be My Neighbor. So David, let's start with you.
You mean how I got to this point? Is that what you mean?
Well, 1 or 2 of your favorite memories of working with Fred.
Okay, oh boy. Well, I'll tell you how I got to this point. I started in 1967. I did not know Fred. I was in Europe for the summer visiting my cousin. I got a telegram, and the telegram said Fred Rogers is going to take a local regional program and it's going national. And my friend, a mutual friend, gave Fred a my name and contact, to make a long story short, I came back and met with Fred, one of the interviewees, and after about an hour, he hired me. And I said, oh, I've got a job for a year. And here I am. And my background is basically not in child development as much as it is in theater and English lit. That's my degree from the University of Pittsburgh, but I worked in children's theater and in summer stock, the typical thing you do when you're trying to be an actor or get into television or theater. That's a quick, is a quick little overview? Is that, did I cover it enough?
That's great. Do you have any memories or any little bits that you remember about Fred that you would love to share with us?
Oh my, there's, yes. A lot of people, you saw this, and he's very, Fred was one of the most brilliant men I knew. But at the same time, he had a wonderful sense of humor. That's what you don't see in the program as much. He's got, it came through a little bit in King Friday, some of his Fred sense of humor. But that's the one thing I appreciated about Fred. He had a great sense of humor, and that's what I remember about Fred. And also his kindness. It came very naturally. And he remembered everybody's birthday. He remembered, he got cards at Christmas, at anniversaries, he got a card. There was a couple who worked for our program who forgot it was their anniversary because they were so busy. Fred remembered. So things like that I remember. It was not an act. That's what I remember that came out of who Fred Rogers was.
That's great. Thank you. Donna, what about you?
I started my career in education, teacher, ed researcher, and finished my PhD, looked for a new job, and I heard about a job at WQED. So I applied for the job, I got it, and I was working for the station, not for the Fred Rogers production company. But the very first day I get on the elevator, and I have a 4-year-old at home who watched Mr. Rogers, and we watched together. But I get on the elevator, and there is Mr. Rogers himself, and I'm telling you, I was verklempt. And Fred had this way of looking you in the eye, and he said to me, I think you're new, aren't you? Yes, I am. And we started to talk, and he just looked at you, and like I said, silence. He just stood there. And so I talked, and I talked, and I talked, and I talked. And by the time we got to our floor, I had told him my whole life story, every course that I'd ever taken, everything that I wanted to do. And he said, why don't you come by sometime and maybe we can do something together? And I did. The WQED said, sure, go talk to Fred. This public television, early days, everyone did everything. And I didn't know production or media or anything. So I went to talk to Fred, and we talked and we talked and we talked, and he found out what I did know. And he said, I have an idea. I've always wondered, what do the grown-ups do with the kids after the show? How do they continue these lessons? How do they know that I've got a lot of information embedded in the stories that we tell? And that became the idea of what you do after the show, and we developed together the Mr. Rogers Plan and Playbook. We started out making it on mimeograph sheets. We brought in other people, and it still exists today.
Yes, it does.
Yeah. And it's still there, and there's still things that you can do after you watch the show. And I was hooked on Fred. So when my husband and I moved to Southern California, and I'm in the middle of the industry and still working for WQED, and Fred died. And after Fred died, and I had to pull over to the side of the road and cry for a little while, and call my husband and say Fred died. And soon after that, I was very active in the Television Academy. The Academy approached 2 of us who were in the children's programming peer group and said they wanted to do something to honor Mr. Rogers. And we created a tribute to Mr. Rogers that we produced in LA. And soon after that, someone was in the audience who said, he happened to work for Ernst & Young, and said they wanted to do something great. And what could they do? And so we started the Mr. Rogers Memorial Scholarship. And for 10 years, I was on the committee that got to pick 4 students a year who would get the scholarship and join our community of people who wanted to continue with that deep, important philosophy that Mr. Rogers stood for. 2 of those scholarship winners now work in the industry here in the Bay Area. Neither one of them could be here tonight. I wanted to introduce you. They just couldn't be here. But come to one of our other events and I'll introduce you to 2 of the winners.
Thank you. And Scott, what about you? What's something that sort of ties you to his organization and maybe a memory or an insight that you could share with us?
Sure. Well, I had started a children's interactive media business a long time ago, and when I started it, I created the dream list of clients I wanted to work with. And right at the top, I had Family Communications, which later became Fred Rogers Productions. And over the years, I got to meet some people at Family Communications, and I remember Bill Eisler, who is the CEO at the time, had reached out to me and said, would you like to come visit our offices? And I did, and I met some other people there, and had done some work with a woman named Kathy Droz, and she happened to give me a book of Mr. McFeely that I brought with me tonight, but sadly left over there. I didn't bring it up on stage with me. And after talking with Kathy for a while about some web work that she needed to be done, Bill Eisler came over to me. He's a tall fellow and kind of booming, and he says, would you like to meet Fred? And I was like, oh yeah, would I? And so he said, follow me. We go down this hallway, and he leads me to this stairwell and opens a door underneath the stairwell. There's a tiny little working area in there. And this was where Fred would do his writing, and he had stepped out for a moment. And I just missed him, but it was funny because at that time I was reading the first Harry Potter to my young son at the time, and you learn that Harry Potter lives underneath the stairs. And that was all I could think of. I was like, wow, how humble. This is his writing room. Well, fast forward from there, we did some work together with Family Communications, and it was sad that I missed him, but what I didn't know was when I got back to my office after the trip to Pittsburgh, my colleagues had written to him in advance to ask for an autographed photo from him, which I received, and I got that just a few months before he passed away. Fast forward, since then I've been invited to a number of Fred Ford conferences at the Fred Rogers Center, and one time when I went, I was invited to have lunch with Joanne. And I had told her, well, I'm a sometimes writer, and I sometimes document things that go on in the children's space. And she said, oh, well, you can interview me sometime if you'd like. So the funny thing is before this movie came out last June, I think it was, we had some time to talk together, and there's an interview with Kidscreen at the time from last June. But what I remember most is all the conversations that didn't make it into the article. Things like I asked her, well, what do you think about television today? What do you think Fred would think? Or who do you think are the Fred Rogers of today? And I remember her saying, it's like, oh, well, I know there are at least 7 out there. There could be many more, but I know they're out there. So that was kind of my brushing with Fred.
That's fascinating. I wonder who those 7 are. That's a very precise number.
Yes.
We talked about it, we're going to
Yeah.
find out.
Great. Well, I was struck during the documentary about how tied Fred's episodes and content were to whatever was relevant of that moment, and how deeply how deeply and authentically he tried to address the topics that were affecting kids in that moment. So in your mind, for those of us who weren't alive in the 60s or need a refresher course of what was happening in the 60s, in your mind, what were some of the biggest issues or problems that kids were facing at that time, and how did Fred Rogers address that through his work? Donna, do you want to start?
Joni may be sorry she gave me this question first, because a couple of years ago, my colleague Becky Hurst Stevenson and I wrote the chapter for
That one just died.
that one died for a children's media book about the. Can you hear us? We wrote a chapter, A Brief History of Children's Media, where we looked at the interplay between what was going on in society and I think Clement wants us to record it, what was going on in society and when did it bubble up into television. So I could talk about this for at least a half a day. Let me just say that, I came of age in the 60s, and it was a very rough time. We know we're at a rough time today. The 60s was a rough time. Everything, was happening too fast for society to keep up. The suburbs were growing and booming, and television came upon the scene, and people didn't know what to expect of it. And there was the Vietnam War, and there was the Civil Rights Movement, and there was violence all around, on the streets, everywhere. It was a very tough time. And why did it happen that, Fred was there at that time to speak back to children, because he was so good about saying, the children are watching, they're seeing things, they're not understanding it at their level. And he understood that it was the responsibility of the adults and certainly of the people who were also coming on and talking to children over the TV to help them understand what was going on in the world. And you saw it there. You saw him take on so many of these topics, and he did it fearlessly. And he knew that people were saying, what's going on, and how does he dare? And he just kept on going.
That's great. Thank you. Scott, did you want to add to that? I'm not sure.
Sure. Is
it?
that okay? There's a few things that I remember and also what I remember when I was a child, and also have learned since being an adult and working in the children's industry. Just to give a kind of paint a little bit of what it looked like from maybe a 3 or 4 year old, their perspective, children's television was Captain Kangaroo, Howdy Doody, and Kukla, Fran, and Ollie. And I was terrified of those puppets. I didn't understand what was going on. I think also too at the time it was the Vietnam War was pretty prominently in the news, and I certainly didn't understand what war was, but I knew guerrillas were angry and they had guns. And I thought, I don't understand, should I not go to the zoo anymore? Or, what is this? And I couldn't find the answer to anything. But one of the interesting things in looking back on what I remember about children's television, and I remember reading an article, I was very fortunate to see Mr. Rogers in the Boston area, because Boston and Pittsburgh received the airing earlier before it went national. So we got to see it for a while before the rest of the country did. And much later, I remember reading an interview with Fred talking about how important it is to have real-life characters speak to children. Many other things as well, but that in particular at a time in the 80s and 90s where it was all cartoon and animated, it was very hard for young children to relate to things that are important in their world through things that were not people. And I look back on the showing and watching of Mr. Rogers I had at the time, it's like, well, that was a very grounding thing for me. That was a human being I could look to that would try to make sure that I felt comfortable with what was going on around me. And I often think about that a lot, as things like, say, Blue's Clues is rebooting with a human, or, just like in the earlier days of Blue's Clues, it's hard to find shows, largely for production reasons and the cost of development, that have real human beings in them. It's a couple of things that I remember from the time.
That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, one other thing, when we talk about, one of Fred's contributions and how seriously he took this job. The 60s, the 70s, a time of a lot of conversation about violence in television. And there were congressional hearings and reports that were written. And one of the things that Fred decided he had to do was speak not only to children, but to the parents. And he developed a primetime show, which was about children seeing the news and not understanding. And what was the name of the show?
Are you talking about the Old Friends, New Friends? Is that the one?
No, this was the primetime show where Fred talked directly to parents and directly to kids. And he kept a story from the neighborhood of make-believe going on at the same time, and explained to parents that one of the ways that children understand what's happening is through imagination, through creativity, and through role-playing. And the value of, as Fred told you in this movie, the puppets, that you could talk to the puppet if you couldn't talk to the grown-up, and the child could relate directly to the puppet. And he kept that going, and because he felt this was so important, not only for the children, but for their parents to come to understand that. He was a real missionary when it came to trying to help grown-ups understand the deep inner life of children. Something that we think because they can use big words or because they act so grown up that they are grown up, and they're not. They're understanding it at a very different level. That's important.
That's a great reminder, Donna. Thank you so much. So let's fast forward to today and consider the same question. So today, we have some pretty terrible things on the news that kids are hearing all the time. And it's not just the news anymore. It's not just a TV in the living room. Now kids are being bombarded by messages that are penetrating all aspects of their life through social media and all the access to screens. And so, kids are hearing things about mass shootings or terrorism or government corruption, whatever the issues are today. They're hearing so many really sophisticated, complex problems. So my question to you, of course, there's also positive things, and I think Fred Rogers would do a great job reminding us about that. But what do you think? How do you think Fred Rogers would address today's issues, if you could? What is one of the issues that you think he would really want to speak about to kids today, and how would he do that? And David, maybe we'll start with you.
Well, he would, I don't know if he would deal with the wall or not, but I think what he would deal with was not so much the political parts of whatever's going on. He would deal with how that can help the child. He'd keep politics out of it. But going back to a little bit of what we did, I think we dealt with big issues like the Kennedy assassination and Martin Luther King and Vietnam and all of that. But there was consistency that he kept. There would be days that we deal with going to see how they make sneakers. Something every day, which I thought was very helpful and reassuring. That's what I liked about the neighborhood, the consistency. And I don't know if we have that in today's television now. It was appointment television. You would watch Mr. Rogers at 12 noon or 5 o'clock. Now it's everywhere. And I don't know if we can ever get that consistency back again. But as we were doing the program, in fact, you saw those helmets on King Friday in that one shot. I made those helmets. And I look forward to going to work every day because in some way I knew what Donna was saying, that I was in some way helping Fred's mission. And I don't know, I can't put words in Fred's mouth what he would do now, but I do know he would talk about the feelings. In the scene with the balloon, he wasn't talking anything political. He was talking how the interior child he was talking to. And that's what I think he would start out dealing with. It's hard to second guess Fred, though. Donna or Scott?
I'm not so sure about particular topics, but I keep thinking, about what I see a lot in the news about overindulgence of screens or too many screens and too much ongoing screen watching, and I sometimes think that there's still not enough information out today. Not all screens are created equal, but I could imagine Fred Rogers saying, balance is important. That this is something that you don't, it's not healthy to overeat, it's not healthy to overindulge with screen viewing either, that a balanced approach is probably the best approach. But I would imagine he would also be telling parents the importance of co-viewing with your child, that there's a lot that the young child doesn't understand, and there's so much more that they're able to understand with you there. And I keep thinking like zone of proximal development, if you know your kind of educational theory. And how much more a child can understand and learn with the guiding help of a parent or caregiver. And I imagine that was a message years ago, and one that certainly feels is important today as well. Okay.
Take the question literally, because Fred was so tuned in to the messages that children were getting. I think there are two things that if he were with us today that he would take on. And one is the images of children being separated from their parents. Children see that and understand that at their level, and it's terrifying. And I think he would address it. I also think that there is an overlaying anxiety that everyone is feeling, and children feel that same anxiety, whether it comes from society, the TV, their own caregivers, parents, whatever caregivers. And I think Fred would try to find a way to address that and try to help children manage the anxiety that is being passed back to them. I don't know.
I think just one quick thing. The most requested subject we ever got was from the fan mail, and it was, can you address divorce? This was back in whenever we did it, 80s, I guess. And it took him, from the time that all the fan mail was coming in, we sort of put it in one pile. It took him about 5 years to process all of that and finally turn it into a program. But and I think he would now address bullying to some certain extent too. But a lot of our ideas came out of what was happening. But a lot of ideas came out of pure child development too, which I think are as important as the sort of sexier things. And I must admit though, that we did some topics so it would get some attention. If the divorce got press for us in a way, and that was not Fred's doing, that was more my doing, and at the same time, it got Fred's message out there. And I'm so delighted about this movie because there are a lot of people who still don't get the neighborhood, and I think this documentary helps a lot. Anyhow, that's my extra 2 cents.
Great, thank you. So today, children have access to technology more so than ever before, and it's certainly not the sort of scheduled programming, TV in the room that we were talking about earlier. They spend considerable amounts of time with technology, and it's some of it's not great, but some of it's amazing, right? They're communicating, they're building, they're creating, they're tinkering, they're learning across phones, tablets, computers, voice command devices, connected toys, robots, and more. How do some of Fred's practices apply across these various types of children's media that we have today? Are there any things that don't translate? And what types of media do you think he'd be most excited about, and why? It's a lot of questions in one.
Oh, okay. Let's see here. In terms of new technologies, I have some thoughts. I keep thinking how he may, Fred Rogers may be a fan of apps and interactive media and tablets and voice technologies. At the same time, I kind of also think about the need for some kind of curation for quality and ethical content. You know, I think there's a big need and some ownership on the likes of Apple and Google and Amazon for creating quality, curated content for kids in those new technologies. But I think with the right developers and the right stories and the right sensitivity to the child's abilities, that you can really do some amazing things. At the same time, I spent an awful lot of time thinking about the pacing of the way the show Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood is at, you know, in its earlier days, and if you play it today. And as I think a number of people might say, that it's like, well, it's a bit slow. And I think, you know, for the audience that he was trying to reach, I think it's a great approach. But you don't see that a lot with children's media today. And I often think about how maybe Fred would be very interested in interactive media because a child could control the pace on their own. So that it could be slow for those that wish to consume it slowly, or those, it could be fast. And I keep thinking about what the benefit there is. But there are many, many more technologies, and you know, I think from what we've all kind of learned about how Fred got into television, because television was somewhat, as Newton Minow said, a vast wasteland at the time, that doesn't just apply to television. That there's a lot of other vast wastelands with new technologies today that need to be thought of a bit more seriously, with more thought and caring in making children's products.
Great, thank you.
I think that Fred would be quick to remind us that anyone who has anything to do with creating product for children should regard themselves as a caregiver whose motto is, think of the children first. Not about the product, not about the technology, and not about the bells and the whistles, but what are you giving to children, and what are you expecting them to get? And how do you convince yourself that you are giving them something that you want them to get? I did a lot of work with media companies about hidden curriculum. You know, what are you teaching children that you're not even aware of? And that always bothers me and makes me feel that as I look out upon this group of people, all of us engaged in nurturing, helping, and even entertaining children, that if we think of them first and think of what do we want them to get from this, and how do we know, how do we help ourselves understand that we're not teaching them something we don't want to teach them. And I think Fred would keep reminding us of that.
Some of the best advice I have ever heard Fred give someone was to Hedda Sherapan, who you saw in the documentary. And she finished her undergrad degree in English Lit and came to Fred because she wanted to get into children's television. And she had an interview with Fred, and he said, go and learn about children. There's a course at the University of Pittsburgh you can take in child development. I went through it. I advise you to go, if you want to get into children's media, any type of children's media that are dealing with children, go and learn about children. And she did. And Fred, I think, thought, well, that's the last I'll see of her. And 2 years later, went through her 2 years program, I guess it was a master's, and she came back, and Fred hired her, and she's still with the company. And I think just knowing children and applying that to whatever media we're in now, when you start to think of it, we're in the same, he started in the early days of television, and he learned about this new medium. And what he wanted to do when he didn't ever want to retire, he stopped making The Neighborhood. He got very ill, but you know what he wanted to do? He wanted to get, the computers were there, then we didn't have all the laptops, but he wanted to make a series of bedtime stories for children. Experiment with that. I don't know exactly what it would have been, but something to do using the current media, but he wanted the adult to be present so they could see this together. So that's just a thought that I thought Fred would do something like that now, I think, using the current medium to make it speak in a very human way, I guess, if that's the best way of saying it.
Let me just mention the Fred Rogers Center, which is located in the outskirts of Pittsburgh on the campus of St. Vincent's College. And the Fred Rogers Center has been developing and distributing a framework for quality in digital media. I encourage you to take a look at it, because what they are talking about is quality children's media has to take into account the child, where the child is, what the age, what stage of development they're at, the content, what are you teaching them, and just what we've been saying, are you confident that you're teaching them something that they're ready for, and the context. Where are they getting this media? What's the situation? How are they getting it? What's the context of how you're delivering the media to them and where they are when they're getting it? I think this is a great place for us to start talking about. All of us in this room are in some way engaged of what the next generation of media is going to be. And we are the carriers of these messages. So I just encourage you all, take a look at the Fred Rogers Center and look for their framework for quality in children's digital media.
I think that's also the policy statement that co-wrote with NAAYC and the Erickson Institute.
Yeah, this was
That's right, 6 years
the
ago.
National
now, I think.
Association for the Education of Young Children.
Correct.
That's great. So what I heard was that, Fred Rogers was viewed the television as a tool, as a medium through which you could interact and provide critical moments and skills for kids. And that any new technology as it's developing now, we can view it in the same way. And that really a deep understanding of the child, to your point, David, is what's helpful and is what's critical. And I think those are great messages, and it kind of leads nicely. It's a nice segue into our last question, which to me is the most important one, is because what I'm hoping we can all take away is something that we can then apply to our own careers or spaces in children's media. So my question is, what is one specific, practical, tangible thing that we can do as people in children's media space to implement Fred Rogers' approaches and ideas to benefit children, or to ensure that his legacy lives on? So there's one thing that as we all leave this space this evening that we can take back to work to make sure either that his legacy lives on, or that we're taking some of his best practices with us into our spaces.
We want to start? Okay. I think how wonderful it would be, just to share developmental stages of children. A 3-year-old is different than a 3.5-year-old, is different than a 5-year-old, is different than a 7-year-old. And I think we as a children's media creation community that might be priority number one for us, but also to think about how can some of that information be shared in easy to digest ways with new parents or even older parents. I also think about how Fred would probably be really behind joint media engagement where you are participating in the media with your children, and I think there is a responsibility on the parents' part to be aware of some of the content that's out there for kids. When I think about, I remember this study, I can't remember if it was 0 to 3 with, back then it was still, where was Vicki Wright out before Common Sense? Kaiser. The Kaiser Family Foundation. They put out this report about, the amount of television viewing or media consumption that was going on, and I remember reading in one of the expanded reports about parents watching television with their children, but it would be things like CSI, crime scene investigation, or Housewives or something like that. And I go like, okay, there needs to be a little bit of schooling with some parents about the appropriateness of some content and what is developmentally appropriate for young children. But I think but very much being a part of their experiences. You hear about today about parents that, I think my kid's playing Fortnite or Minecraft, and they have no idea what it is. And I know sometimes it's very hard for a parent to get in there, but to ask a teacher, or in particular a librarian, ask a librarian, they always know. They can help you out. And to take it on as a task, to be involved in that way and knowing what your children are experiencing with this kind of medium.
We've been pretty much talking about the thing that I think is, is the most important, and that is we need to have a seat at the table for all media creation of someone who understands how children grow and develop. I think that that's part of the mission that we have with the Children's Media Association, is to encourage and when we find people who know something about child development and they get a seat at that table, to support them, to know that it's not easy. I've certainly been there. I've spent years, being told, you want to be educational. But you just keep coming back and you keep coming back, and eventually you have people who will say, you know what, I thought about what you said, and some of them become my friends for life. It is happening. I have a colleague here in this room who was invited to join a company because the company created a product, and they suddenly found that it was being sold to children, and they said, if we're going to have this children buying this, we better know how children are using it and what they're doing. Now, that young woman is here tonight, and I can tell you that it's not easy, and we have to support the young people who get that opportunity to, keep going on with the fight, because we've been there and we can help you fight that fight.
Well, can I share something?
Sure.
Yeah, sorry. I was also thinking too about how to support good quality media creation, and I think about where the legacy of Mr. Rogers is right now with new shows like Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood, and what does that mean in terms of licensed product. And sometimes it's really hard to make a quality show without funding, whether it's grants or other kinds of fundraising. But and I think about, you can probably find yourself some Daniel Tiger bedspreads or Band-Aids or toothbrushes. And I think about what Fred would say to that today. And at the same time, the balancing act that is needed to be on air, to be brave to go in front of a congressional testimony and ask for $20 million. It's very hard to make quality stuff and be able to keep the lights on and do it in an ethical way.
I think we also need to have more people who can be translators, people who understand how the media industry works, along with understanding how children can use and learn from media. And I think there's a huge need in higher education to train more people, to create these translators who can then give seminars, can go to industry, can talk about how you can, how you can do it both, and keep the lights on. Let's not kid ourselves, that is important.
I can only sum it up by agreeing with both of you. You said it all. And I go back to what Fred said, go and learn about children. The child development is so important. And he, of course, concentrated on the preschool years. But if you're doing a program for 11 and 12-year-olds, that's a different subject, but it's still knowing how they perceive television and what their needs are. And so I think that anybody going into media, any kind of media for children, should have some sort of knowledge of children, a degree or a class at least. But that sort of sums up what both of you just said. And yeah, you do need a budget. And you can't do a program without money. And it's just how you get that money and how you bend the rules somewhat. But Fred always said he never wanted to make a consumer out of children. And that's easy to say, but it's hard to do, I think, when you're making a television program. But learn about children, that would be my advice.
Okay, we're gonna switch over to audience questions, but before we do, Donna sent me this quote by Fred Rogers that I want to share with all of you. Fred Rogers said, "I recently learned that in an average lifetime, a person walks about 65,000 miles. That's 2.5 times around the world. I wonder where your steps will take you, and I wonder how you'll use the rest of the miles you're given."
That's our challenge.
There you go.
There we go. So at this point, do you have questions for the panel?
Comments, questions, anything?
Yes.
So when I was like 4 years old, I remember distinctly watching Mr. Rogers. But everyone's looking at me, so everyone's like watching. I was watching Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood when I was like 4 years old, and then when I became 13, it became really hard for me to watch it. So I was thinking like, has he ever intended to appeal to teenagers, or was it mostly focused on elementary to younger kids?
Can you say that?
Did he ever try to age up? Did he ever try to
Age
appeal
up.
to teenagers? He did
Teenagers.
adults and preschoolers, but did he ever focus on, teenagers?
I think Fred's specialty was a preschooler. We never did anything that I'm aware of for teenagers, except he did a lot of speaking to schools, high schools, and they were very receptive to his message because they grew up with Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And when he did speak to them, they almost were 5 and 6 years old again when he spoke to them. So and the other thing, it's just my, armchair theory, but I think teenagers respond to him because they're in high school and they're about to go to the cruel world, which is, when you move out of high school, you're going to the cruel world, a college or something, and it's scary. But I think they remember the time that they were very comfortable when they were 3, 4, or 5 years old, watching Mr. Rogers with their teddy bear or their blanket. That's a very comfortable time for the most part. Here they are, teenagers, and I think they remember those times. I guess it's called permissible regression. And I think in that way, teenagers respond to me. They never, to my knowledge, I can't remember if I'm doing any programming directly for teenagers. Does that sort of answer your question?
It is.
I don't know, that's the best I can do. Anybody else have any thoughts?
Other questions? Yes, Donna.
So I have a couple of comments and a question, I guess. First of all, just in terms of my takeaways, and I would encourage us all to sort of think about, like, what's that one or two things that you want to take away from tonight. And I would say for me, number one, it was just the deep responsibility that we all have in these jobs. And I'm thinking of a comment I gave Matt this week on a project he was working on where, the importance of, using proper English in, it's the little things. And just remembering that, kids learn from every single thing you do. And so just like that deep, deep responsibility. And the other thing that's just, I wanted to comment on is just like, feel how we all feel right now. Like there is a quiet, there is a calm that I personally can't remember the last time I had felt like this calm. And I think the movie did such a beautiful job of kind of getting us in that place. And I think you guys have done a beautiful job of keeping us in that place. And I think for me, just that pause, how to find that quiet and that silence and that space. I think, and I commented to Matt at the beginning, like, I was one of the, Mr. Rogers was too slow for me as a kid. Like, it wasn't, Electric Company was my favorite show. I watched Mr. Rogers, but I was more of an Electric Company kid, and I still am. But right now, it's like, I yearn for Mr. Rogers. And I think there was one other thing I wanted to say, but that's really my challenge to all of you, and I just really want to thank all of you for being here.
I just wanted to say one thing about, you said about using good English, etc. There was a song that was written called I Like You As You Are. And Fred wrote the music, but he didn't write the lyrics. It was Josie Carey. It was one of the earlier songs. And Josie came in with his song called I Like You Are. And it's much catchier. I like you are, rhymes, and it's perfect. And Fred said, we can't do that. We've got to call it I like you as you are. That's how much he thought about children.
The attention to detail,
It's just a little example of how he mentioned it in the respect he had for childhood. That's just a little example of his respect for childhood. And
I remember the other thing I wanted to say, which is, Scott, you made the comment about, product. And, I was at Nickelodeon in the early days when we first launched Rugrats and Doug and Ren and Stimpy, and, product came with it. And my philosophy, and the people in the programming department were very purist about, like, we're whoring shows and, it's art, it's not about product. And I really believe, and I still do, that kids today, when they love a character, they want a piece of that character. And whether that is their bed sheets or the stuffed animal or the toothbrush, there's a comfort in like having a piece of it. So I would push back to you on that I think, and my philosophy, and I was I've done lots of things in this business, but when I was producing product, my philosophy was, if you are making product with integrity, and there's lots of people on this panel who have made product with integrity, as long as you're making the best damn toothbrush or the best darn, alarm clock, and it's quality, then you're doing good work. So I just want to push back on like the fact that commercialism is kind of a bad. I feel like there was a suggestion that was sort of a bad thing, and I think, giving kids a way to participate in the whole.
Donna's right. She's talking about the child development people know the transitional object. If children have a blanket that one of their characters identified with, and they take it with them, it's comforting. I never had a problem with product. I just have a problem with bad product. I'm curious to know, and I don't want to take away Scott and add more. I just want to know if any of you learned something about Mr. Rogers that you didn't know before.
Great question.
Front row.
Oh, I didn't realize that was like a specific question.
I was struck by his perception of other people. the litmus test that he talked about with the child at the beginning of the documentary, with the ear being torn off of a toy, the response to that really could have gone almost any direction and still been appropriate and whatever. And my interpretation of that moment in his retelling of it is that he actually was just right on the same wavelength as that child, what that child needed to hear right then and there. And I think that's a really special gift. And what was clear, like throughout his life, especially like with the Coco, so those are kind of like the bookends for me, right? Of that openness, and like I actually have some acting in my background as well, so this is kind of like actor language, being open. But there is an openness to the present moment and what somebody else is actually experiencing right here, right now, their sort of deepest self, which he clearly was just so fluent in, and he lived his life that way. It's just inspiring. So,
Ian, did you have something to add?
I want to add on to what my wife Donna said earlier, which is talking about the anxiety that kids feel today. I have a feeling that if Fred were alive today, and saying we can't reach kids unless we first reach ourselves as adults. There's a recent article of the Atlantic that says, why are we all so angry? And I think that we, as much as we need, and I agree with child development, there's no question about it. The thing that Fred said, look for the helper, who are the helpers? Going to help us get over this terrible divide and anxiety that we're all feeling, because it's all consuming. And I'm consumed about and consumed by it as much as anybody else. The thing that grabbed me from the movie at the very end is what the hate was doing to kids and what it's doing to all of us. And that's what I believe if Fred were alive today, would be saying, what can I do to help us come together? Not forget, and not gloss over what's dividing, because we can't do that. But how can we engage, even if we shout at one another? A semblance of conversation. We can begin to understand why people are the way they are and what's going on. And that is what I think we have to address ourselves before we can address the kids, otherwise we can't help it.
Scott briefly sort of alluded to this television show, Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood. And so my question is about that. For those who don't know, it's sort of like an animated Mr. Rogers spin-off, sort of, where Daniel Tiger is the lead. And he sort of discusses all sorts of topics that are relatable to preschoolers, but I personally think this show is amazing. And I formerly worked at PBS Kids and worked on a lot of the digital games. And so my question is, first of all, how do you think Fred would have received this show, and particularly the digital components of it? There are tons of apps, tons of web games related to Daniel Tiger that help kids manage their emotions and even just understand what it feels like to experience emotions. And obviously these are all teachings that Fred was so passionate about. And so I'm wondering, what would he have thought of this show and sort of like the continuation as it goes on?
Wow, Suvi.
Scott can answer that.
Yeah.
Well, I'm happy to, but
Go ahead, go for it.
I mean, I'm not part of the show. I know a number of people who have been. I think it's a pretty fabulous show as well. Some of the games and some of the apps are okay. Some of them are not as good. And it's just like, well, it's the constraints of budget and time and so forth. But I think I'd like to think he'd be pretty excited by it. I think it's a great tribute to his legacy. They're great shows. In fact, but there are also other shows under Fred Rogers' production as well, isn't there? There's a Design Squad is one of them. I mean, the other ones I don't know quite as well.
Peg plus Cat.
Oh, I love
Peg
Peg plus Cat is great.
And the other is the other math show.
We'll never remember.
Yeah.
But yeah, they've got other shows under the umbrella.
Mhm.
of the Fred Rogers Productions.
Fred Rogers Productions.
But Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood, by the way, is one of the most successful shows on public television, and it's in 25 countries now. So it's very interesting that Daniel Tiger started on the Children's Corner as a very small hand puppet, and 50 years later, he's an international star. And so that's a tribute to Fred's hard work, because have you all ever seen Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood? KQED airs at, I think, around 10:30 in the morning. It's certainly worth watching to see the legacy. And Daniel is the Mr. Rogers character. And see it and compare it and see it's really, it's animated. Except there's one interstitial.
I know that after Fred died, there were a lot of conversations about what would the company do next. And there was a pretty quick consensus that there would not be another Mr. Rogers. And so where do you go from there to keep the legacy alive? And the idea to, and I also can remind you that, you know, the reason that Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood didn't travel around the world is because of the difficulty of you can't flip-flap. You can't record that voice in other languages and have it be authentic.
And it's expensive too.
And yeah, so, you know, so when we come to today and you want to continue the legacy, and there will be another Mr. Rogers, and, you know, and you can't necessarily do something that you can't travel around the world, animation became the way to do it. What would Fred think of it, and what about all that other stuff? It's part of today's world, and I think he was very open to what was happening in the world. I don't think he would say, I think it's all great, but he would try to pick what he could help and change and do something about, and he would work at that.
I think on that note, I'm so sorry, but we're gonna have to end the discussion, the questions. We're so over time. Jason's gonna come on stage now and do the raffle. So if you can all find your raffle ticket.
And I'll be
If
out.
you don't have a raffle ticket, let us know. You
Yes.
must have one.
And after the raffle, David has kindly agreed to sign more of his photos and do pictures, so please feel free to meet and greet after.
David has his Mr. McFeely hat
You remind me you put it on.
bag.
Were they gonna get extra raffle tickets you can have?